Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to our audience. Tomorrow's technician back again with another live stream sponsored by Summit Racing. This time I've got Mark Lake with me, and we're going to be discussing something you'll deal with every day when you're working on a vehicle: fasteners, particularly threaded fasteners and also threaded fittings. These are critical, and it's critical to understand the physics and also the engineering behind a threaded fastener to make sure that you understand, what's the importance of a torque wrench? What's the importance of using the correct fastener made of the correct materials? Joining me, Mark Lake from Summit Racing. You are the trainer, technical trainer?
Yes. Yep. We do all the technical training for the new hires, senior reps, what have you.
So this is one thing some of the students may not understand is what are the physics behind a threaded fastener and how does it hold stuff together?
Yeah, the big thing that when you start talking about the physics, you start talking about it is ultimately the strength. The less likely it is to separate when you start to tighten that bolt. And different fasteners and different grades of bolts are able to hold, and it not only the grade, but then also what the bolt is made out of. If you compare a grade 8 bolt from, say your standard hardware store or a ARP bolt,
yeah.
The strength, characteristics between those bolts are quite a bit different.
Well, and it's the metallurgy too, because something like the Subaru head bolt, it's designed to stretch quite a bit when it's holding the head onto the block.
Sure.
And, just the friction and understanding, what's the difference between a coarse thread and a fine thread and which can hold more clamping force.
Right.
That's critical. Usually from what, a coarse threaded type of fitting, which would kind of be like this one. I'm going to hold this up here in front of my face. This one is for a shock bolt on I think it's a Ford vehicle. And it's pretty coarse thread. And, I use this thread gauge to kind of measure it out. And, this is pretty coarse, but the threads are a little bit deeper than most. So it's able to create this surface area. And then on top of it, it's even going to stretch and clamp onto the shock that goes into a lower control arm.
Yeah. You could even compare that to like, head bolts. Everybody's very common engine that we deal with at Summit is an LS head. They're a metric, very fine thread bolt. Considerably stronger. So the threads play a big factor in it. But then, you start talking about, say, like an ARP bolt. I know I've said that, but you talk about a chromoly bolt that can handle, a clamping force of 200,000 psi. And then, you say the LS. Well, now you're talking about a bolt that is, if it's a racing engine, it's something that you're going to tear down multiple times. It's something that you're going to have to reuse multiple times. Then you have to start talking about, well, can you reuse it? Because some of them are what you call torque to yield bolts. Now, your typical torque to yield bolts, you can only reuse it never.
Yeah.
It's one-time use. So there's a lot of factors that come into play. What are you doing? Is this something you're going to take apart? How strong is it? There's a lot of factors that come into play that people overlook.
True. And, you mentioned torque to yield. Here is a bolt that holds the rack on, I want to say Ford F-150 with electric power steering rack. And I'll hold this in front of my face so you can hopefully see this. But this is torque to yield. I think this is well over 350 some foot-pounds to be torqued down, and then I think it's another 60 degrees. Mm-hmm. And you look at this, and this is the area supposedly that's supposed to stretch once you get it in there. And, this is a pretty beefy bolt compared to like this one, that I don't know where this one came from. But, this isn't torque to yield. But some of the torque to yield stuff you can actually identify.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So you mentioned something interesting in there, PSI. Mm-hmm. How does that factor into, like a ARP bolt or?
Ultimately, how much strength. So like you start running into this with like ARP stuff, when you start talking naturally aspirated to a boosted application
Yep.
or nitrous, it's less likely to break.
We just had a question come in. This is from Jeff. He's wondering, what's the difference between a head bolt and a head stud, and which one is better?
It depends on what you're doing. So, like people, I feel like they overpay a lot when it comes to head studs versus head bolts. If it's a naturally aspirated application, it's a race engine that you might tear down once or twice, and it still can be high horsepower, 800 to 1,000 horsepower. Really, a bolt is really all you need. Where when you start talking about a head stud, now that stud is going to be considerably stronger. So now the boosted application, it could even be just nitrous. That the reason why you would use a head stud versus a bolt is when that bolt, the top of that bolt, that's the weakest part of that bolt is the top of it. So when you put it in a boosted application, that's putting out high PSI, high numbers. That tip of that bolt is more likely to stretch and break off. Where in a head stud, it's still the weaker part, but not all that pressure is at that one singular part of that head stud. The head stud just threads down in hand tight, and then you take that nut, and that nut is what tightens the head down. So it's a considerably stronger application compared to a bolt.
Thanks for that question, Jeff. And as a reminder to our audience, please type in your questions in the comment box, or else just check in with us too from your school, and we'll answer them as they come up on our feed. But yeah, it's interesting, fasteners in general, how they secure, the clamping load. This is a oil pan drain plug. And it's kind of interesting that, you look at the torque specification, it's usually 25, 30 foot-pounds. It's not really that much for a fastener that looks like this beefy as far as the threads go, their coarse thread. So it's a common mistake that, by tightening it tighter, it's going to hold them there better. But the reality of it is, all it's sealing is this little grommet here and creating that pressure and compression to hold it in.
Right. Yeah, it's just sealing. So, that's a rubber grommet, but some of them even have like a crush washer, almost like a, yeah.
Or even
like a banjo bolt, yeah.
Yeah, making sure that, this is why they always tell you to replace the copper washers when you replace a banjo bolt or a brake caliper, is that these are deformed and crushed.
But it fits in the groove perfectly, though.
Oh, but then when you sit on the pedal, it's leaky.
Definitely. It is something that you should always do. And it doesn't matter if you get the hose or you get the caliper. They should always come with a set of new washers.
Kind of question just came in from one of the instructors. Is it going to be metric or a standard? And is there a way to tell easily between a metric fastener versus a standard fastener?
It's there is easy ways. You can start to get pretty good at it just by even looking at the threads after you do it for so long. But then you can also look at the head of the bolt. The head of the bolt will even tell you as well.
It's like, this is metric, I know that for sure. I don't think I have really too many standard fittings, so I think this one might be standard. So yeah, this has the 3 for the different grades.
Yep.
So it's sort of interesting. I actually, before I came in here, I printed this out as far as what grade 1 looks like, metric versus that, and 4.6. So like the 3 toughest grades are grade 8,
Yep.
10, and 12. What's kind of the difference between those two? Is it just a question of the size of the bolt, or is it just the materials that are used?
It's the material, it's the strength, right? So like you saw the three markings on the head of that bolt. So that's a grade 5 bolt. Okay. Where you go to like a grade 8 bolt, generally they'll have, what is that, 5 markings on it?
Yeah, 5 markings on it. On there, yeah, and there's also a STMA grade, and it's kind of confusing. So don't feel bad about using one of these guides like I've had to, because I've forgotten it every time. But yeah, look at the head of the bolt.
And then he asked, okay, is there an easy way to identify that? So a standard bolt generally will have those little dashes, whereas a metric bolt, it'll have the actual number grading typically on the head of that bolt. I think they do, what is that, 8.8 and 10.9?
Yep, and then
Okay.
12.9, I think.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. So it's generally labeled on the head of the bolt. On the end of that bolt, you'll generally see it. But then, that is the easy way to answer his question. But then also, after you've unfortunately had to replace so many bolts, you can start to look at the threads even, and you're like, I don't even need to look at the head of the bolt. It's a metric fastener. Because generally a metric fastener is a considerably more fine thread bolt, where a standard fastener is considerably more coarse. So
I think this is 10.9 JH. I remember where I pulled this out of. I never throw bolts away. It's sort of a...
Oh, no. Yeah, no, I think my wife calls it a hoarding characteristic. But the funny thing is as soon as we need one, it's always like, well, just go to the bolt bin. It's like, oh, okay, so it's good to hold on to all of them? Yes. If you throw away a bolt, you're not a real mechanic.
Yeah, it's so... I've got buckets. I've sorted them and everything else, and it's just... I need to make sure that I have something left over and something breaks. I don't even remember the car that this came off of. So thought this is kind of interesting bolt too, because it's got Loctite. I don't even remember what this is off of yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's definitely something I think most guys will do, especially because a lot of times you'll take something apart and it'll come with a new set of bolts. So you're like, oh, I'll put the new set of bolts on there, but then I'll keep these other ones. These other ones were never torque to yield. Because like we've talked about before, we mentioned, you can't really reuse a torque to yield bolt. But a lot of times, especially brake jobs, front end parts, struts, CV axles, wheel bearings, brakes, all that stuff will come with new bolts. So I'm always that hoarder that, keeps the keeps the old bolts.
This is what I kind of use to sort through a lot of my bolts to figure out, what size. Okay, this is an M10 over here. Oh no, M12 goes through the hole, and then you can pull up the back. I think you can get these on Amazon, or I think Summit Racing even has classified. That's why I bought also this thread pitch guide. But you can measure and look at what the pitch is, and there's other tools out there. There's actually like, you've seen them at the store or whatever. You
Hardware store.
Yeah, you have the ones where you can screw in your bolt and figure out what size it is too.
So my only complaint with that, and I guess maybe it's a me thing, not everybody's going to agree with me, but so they sell those ones like he was saying, that thread that you can thread the bolt into. It's like a glorified nut that you thread it into, and then on the other side it'll have like part of the bolt on the opposite side that you can kind of compare it. My only complaint with that is that, you can force anything anywhere. So, most mechanics, they have a really strong grip. Well, they have a strong grip because they're used to breaking things loose. Well, you can start to thread a bolt in there real easy and it kind of fits. Well, then you're like, well, I don't know if this is standard, if this is metric, or if it's, 14 thread or 20 thread. And then you'll go down, you'll be like, oh, well, this kind of threads in here. And so now you're kind of sitting there and you're like, well, does this fit? Does this fit? So, kind of my all check all is this thread pitch gauge. Because you can take this, and it's just like a glorified comb, but what you end up doing is you set it on the thread of the bolt. and it'll either line up or it doesn't. And if it doesn't sit perfectly in those grooves, it's the wrong one. And let me tell you, I'm sure everybody have seen those memes, where people are like, if you see a guy with this and a set of drill bits, run, But this is probably one of the most overlooked tools that everybody should have, because at some point you're going to break a bolt in a whatever, and you're going to need to figure out the thread pitch. So this is kind of like a check-all, where you check the thread pitch, and then what I use to measure the diameter is a set of calipers. Again, yeah, something like that. It is really simple to check this. But he is correct. They do have those tools at any hardware, in any place. It's sitting there. But, like I said, you could force something in there really where it's not supposed to be, and then you get home and you're like, oh man, this is the wrong bolt.
Question just came in from Jack. He was wondering, the different materials from a bolt can be aluminum, steel, or even stainless steel. Is there something you should or should not do when maybe getting a new bolt, like avoid stainless steel or aluminum? Or
depends on what it's going in.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, there's also chromoly. Again, I'm going to say it, ARP. It depends on what is it going in. I think it's a great question. What material should go in what. But the big thing that we run into is the strength. And then, what are you threading this into? Is this going into something that's going to hold coolant? Is this something that's just going to be out in the elements, like a suspension part? Is this something that's going into something metal? Because you wouldn't want to use an aluminum bolt on a steel part, because it's more than likely going to seize inside there and snap and break. So there's a lot of factors. You don't want to use aluminum and steel together. You don't want to use. There's no reason to use a stainless steel bolt if it's never going to see any elements. So.
Well, and also too, from what my understanding, it's the ductility or the malleability of it, because this type of steel they used on this one, it's kind of it will stress and come back and stretch and do different things. And if you replace something with like a stainless steel,
sure,
you could crack.
Yeah, well, yeah, and yeah, that's a good point, because no matter what, like in most instances, a bolt is going to have. And it's not like you're going to sit there and watch the bolt stretch. It's not like a heartbeat.
Yeah. It's a little bit.
It's a tiny bit. And what he's talking about is when you tighten that bolt down and it's nice and snug inside there, if you get that stainless steel bolt, it'll end up snapping and breaking because of that material. So I think that's a really good point to definitely point out. Because again, the material is a big deal.
Question just came from Adam in regards to what do the different finishes on bolts do for the final product, or if it's installed? That's an interesting question, because I know we've got I think this is called cadmium plating. I'll put that one right there. This one is a black oxide. And then we have, I think this is like a zinc type finish. And then on the OE side, we have something called Darko, or their finish designed to resist corrosion. Is any one better than the other?
So, again, I hate to say this, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but what are you doing?
Yeah.
So, and I say that because, if somebody's trying to build, maybe let's just say on an engine, we'll say somebody's rebuilt an engine and they're wanting new engine bolts. Okay, we offer a couple like ARP and Gardner Westcott. But okay, is this, you don't want to have all four of these in your engine bay, because it just looks like, a cobbled mess. So the personally, I like the black oxide ones. And again, they sell that through ARP. But it's something that, it gives you a nice seamless finish, like it was all specifically bought from one bolt kit. But then I go back to what are you doing, where it's like, well, dude, all I really care about is it snugly fits together. Well, then, yeah, that's your standard ARP, your standard OEM bolt is fine. So I don't know if necessarily one is better than the other. It's more like, what is better? What are you doing? What is your end goal?
Interesting question coming here is, are washers optional? I mean, if you take one away, I'd just say wait on, that's a definite race car if you don't use one of these.
Yeah, I mean, you'll never have to worry about stopping. No, it's I've probably always used washers in any instance, especially when they've been used before. There's certain spots where the head of the actual bolt is large enough in diameter, and when you run the nut down on top of it, it snugly clamps that component well enough. Where, if you don't use the washer and it's too small of a diameter of head of the bolt, it'll sit in that hole cockeyed, and you won't be able to clamp it properly, and the bolt will be at the wrong angle, and it'll never be tightened properly. So, again, I hate to say it, but what are you doing? What was there to begin with, and what diameter of the bolt was it, from the start?
That's washers are important for clamping loads and also vibration and.
Oh, for sure. And then the other thing with a lot of washers is they're grooved. They even have a lot of grooved washers. You talk about vibration, but then so that bolt is less likely to lose that clamping force. So they're less likely to back out.
Good question just came in. This is from Brian, the Car Geek. If I'm building something custom, so no service information or torque specs are available, what would you say is the best resource to find the torque specs for a bolt size and thread?
Number one, what is that bolt made of?
Okay.
So the bolt made of is a really big thing, because certain, you can't say a 3/8 16 thread bolt is a 3/8 16 thread bolt, because then you have the bolts that are made of different types of materials. So number one, what is the bolt made out of? And then number two, what's the diameter of the bolt, and the overall length of that bolt? So, again, if you buy an aftermarket bolt, typically ARP, no torque specs, no nothing, they'll say, okay, to have this bolt properly torqued, that you need X amount of foot-pounds. And they have a guide on their website that says, okay, you buy this bolt with this thread pitch made of this material, it needs to be torqued down at this amount. And even a lot of just standard, hardware store bolts, they're the same way. It's this diameter, this thread is torqued down to this amount.
Got a question from, looks like Jessica. She has a question about Nylox. And can a Nylox fastener be reused? So I think we're talking about that little thing in there.
Yeah. I've never had good luck reusing them.
Yeah.
Never. I mean, and the only reason why is because as soon as you go to tighten, retighten this or loosen it, a lot of that Nylox insert will come out the backside of that nut, and then when you go to tighten it, it just gets pushed back in, and it's really not holding anything in there. That's the whole purpose of it, is to prevent that nut from losing that, that tighten. So as soon as you torque that down to whatever you decide to torque it down to, generally I've found that it's one-time use.
Kind of spurns another question. What about Loctite? And as far as which ones to use for any application, blue, red, I've seen yellow lately.
I've learned this. I was at the ASE convention last year in Texas, and Permatex did a thing where they said, okay, you use this Loctite, with this type of bolt, and then they also came down with, is this something that you're going to take apart again? Is this something going to be constantly taken apart? Because now they have different grades of, Loctite, or, their Permatex name of it, where it says it's still the strength of the red, but allows you to take it apart like the blue. Because as soon as you use the red Loctite, you better have the hands of God in order to get that apart. It's not coming apart. Whereas, like a blue, it's still pretty tight, still less likely to come apart without a Loctite. But it's easier to take that bolt back out. So it again depends on what you're doing. Is this something you're taking apart again, or is this just something? Hey, I just want to replace this clutch. I just want to replace this flywheel. I just want to get this done, and it can't be coming apart again. This is something that needs to be extremely tight and not lose any grip. So I would refer to their chart. They have specific charts on their website that tells you, do's and don'ts. Hey, you can use this color Loctite with these types of bolts. You can use this color Loctite with these type, and it kind of breaks it down. It's really neat.
The good thing with like Loctite now is a lot more auto manufacturers I think they heard us technicians talking about some of the different grades as far as a way to prevent corrosion between a dissimilar metal, a fastener, and let's say a aluminum lower control arm. Best advice I've ever had and best tool I've ever used to get out Nylox and also Loctite is an induction heater.
Oh,
you
yeah.
put over the bolt, it burns it out. It's great. You zip it off.
Yeah, that's something. That was when the first time I saw that, I thought it was, a complete joke. Just watching somebody walk up and put it on a bolt, then it heats it up, then they pull it off, and you're like, okay.
Yeah, it's been probably the best thing that I've ever invested in, not just for rusty parts, but for Nylox and thread locking compound. It can just burn it, zip it off, and you're good.
Yeah, that is something that for as cheap as they are, and living up here at the Rust Belt, I guess we got coined that term. If you're constantly dealing with these bolts that are not coming out, a lot of suspension parts, a lot of brake parts, a lot of all that, that is something that you really, 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 really would benefit from using. And it would be a huge help to yourself because nobody likes breaking a bolt off in something.
Got a question from Josh here. He is wondering, what's the difference between a thread chaser and a tap and die, and when should you use it depending on a certain condition?
So this is your typical thread chaser. Your thread chaser, I kind of, I call it just something that, let's say you tear down an engine and you're getting ready to rebuild it. I would always take every bolt hole on that engine and run a thread chaser through each and every bolt hole, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. And the reason why is because you're just making sure those threads are clean. That way when you run that bolt through there, it's getting the proper clamping force, and there is a bunch of gunk in that one bolt hole that you should have went through. So this is just like a, hey, I'm making sure everything's good. Whereas a tap and die set, your typical tap and die set is a lot more aggressive. So it's something that, the threads are gone, or there is no threads, and you need to properly install a thread, threads in that hole, in that, or on that bolt. Maybe you took the bolt out and the threads are no longer on the end. So this is a lot more of an aggressive piece that, either the threads aren't there, or you're needing to install threads, something like that. This is just kind of like a, hey, I want this easy to go together. I want it to thread properly together.
Great question from Dan here, and he is wondering about, oh gosh, what is it he's asking here? Helicoils. Do you believe in them? Do they work? Is that a valid repair?
Yes and no. Yes, if it's not something that is under high duress, high strength, high, cylinder head bolt hole, no. No. But have I done it on a timing cover? Yeah, I've done it on a timing cover. I've done it on a couple engines like that. I've done it oil pan rail on a block. Yeah, I've done that a couple of times. So, again, what are you doing? Is it a light, torque capacity thing? Absolutely, I would do it in a heartbeat. Head bolt hole, a crank for like a flex plate or flywheel, run. I wouldn't do it. High strength components, no. Light duty, it's just a timing cover, absolutely.
This kind of brings us to one of the things we're talking about, fittings.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting thing especially with Summit Racing and AN fittings. And what's the difference between like an AN fitting versus, let's say, like a brake hose or something underneath the hood of a car, like a quick disconnector?
I mean, that conversation could go forever, but I will say this. So your typical AN fitting, okay, let's just get this out there. There, at least to my knowledge, there's never been a factory AN fitting. So this is something aftermarket, okay? This is, hey, maybe I'm plumbing a fuel system, and I need to run from my tank up to my engine a fuel system. So what's really nice about running an AN fitting is the hose is very flexible, makes it very simple to route from the tank up to the engine. Super simple. Some of them can be reused. Some of them will allow you to swivel. We were just talking about this before. If you can ever get a swivel fitting, pay the extra amount. It's worth doing. And that's a lot with AN fittings. AN fittings allow you to swivel. We were talking about this in the context of, AN fittings, you typically get them, most common, there's a ton of degrees, but the most common is straight, 45, and a 90. Okay? They come in all these different, crazy angles and everything. Most common are straight, 45 and 90. Well, that straight 45 and 90 was great, but what if you need the fitting, instead of facing this way at a 90, you need it to face this way? And it's not swivel, so that when you tighten it down, it's pointed in that direction, whether you want it or not. So the nice thing with AN fittings, if you get a swivel one, that you can turn that fitting and not loosen that actual fitting at all. So the ease of installation, the other part with being able to swivel that fitting, the other cool thing is it allows you to actually make the hoses and fittings look cool. I mean, most of the time, when you're running AN fittings in a hose, depending on how cheap and how much you're running, you're probably $200 to $500 easily into it. So nobody likes to spend $200 to $500 on something and all that time to put it together and make it look stupid, right? Make it look like crap. So you end up getting, you're able to dress up that engine bay. It kind of looks more like a race engine, but it's also easy to install. You cut the hose, real simple to cut the hose, real simple to put the fittings on. So that's the big draw in doing that.
And I've got a challenge to our audience right now. If anybody is the first in the comments to tell me what AN means, they're going to win a free Babcock's Garage Tomorrow's Technician t-shirt. So keep that answer coming in there. And yeah, fittings are they're one of these things with the application. It's so critical, making sure, especially on stock vehicles. I mean, you have quick disconnects, you have hose clamps like this, the constant tension that people hate, but I actually like a whole lot better than a worm gear. But as far as, the different sizes of hoses, so what's an AN10 fitting? What's the size of that?
So when you see 6AN, 8AN, 10AN, you're probably wondering what the diameter of that hose is. So like a 6AN is your 3/8, your 8AN is 1/2 inch, your 10AN is what, 5/8. So it depends, it's not as easy as, and I believe there's even a mathematical formula that allows you to take, I can't remember it now, but it's like, if you put 6 over, I can't remember it, but I've just had it memorized for so long that you get this size for this. So again, we'll go back to fuel systems, right?
Yeah.
So fuel systems, typically everybody for most mild applications run a 6. Okay. When you start jumping up into numbers of 600-700 horse, probably the 8 to 10 factor. Typically 8. And then when you start to get in well over 1,000, you're easily 10AN, 12AN fitting.
Okay, we had a response back. This one comes from Dan again, and AN, Army, Navy.
Yep.
It's a mil spec.
Yep.
Which is sort of an interesting thing with these because was it World War II they came up with these different size fittings?
Yeah. Yeah, it was, and here's another thing. I wonder if anybody knows. Do you use Teflon tape with male AN fittings?
Let's see if we get some responses back.
Because there's a big no-no and a big yes with that.
If it's a male fitting, wait for a custom. I'm going to take a stab at it. Is it, you don't use it because that's the part that's not sealing?
Yeah, there's no reason to use it. The only reason that you would do, you do it, okay? Let's say you're in a really tight bind and you don't have the right fitting and you're at the racetrack and you're like, man, I just need to make one more run. Then I can run and, snag some fittings off the guy next to me in the trailer. I can't say I've never done that before, but I can't confirm or deny it either. So I'm just telling you, if you're having to use Teflon tape on an AN fitting, it's wrong. It's broke. It's not flared properly. It's not whatever. You gotta realize they don't make a bunch of money selling one fitting. So they got to make thousands per day in order to make any money. So they're not the quality check on a lot of these fittings. And I'm not just saying the cheapos. I'm not saying just all the high dollar ones. If you thread this together and it doesn't seal and you're like, aha, let me get some Teflon tape or some pipe dope around it. No, it's wrong. It's wrong. Because you got to realize what is the sealing part of that AN fitting. It's the flare. It's flared, so it's supposed to seat against that female fitting and seal it.
It's like a brake hose.
Yeah.
Except the brake hose will use a, 37-degree flare to where an AN fitting is 45, if I'm correct. So that's an interesting thing. And plumbing some of these systems, they can be difficult because, economically, if you're a student, you're having to deal with the straight fittings are cheaper.
Oh, yeah.
Versus, something like a fancy swivel or something else, and you'll try to engineer your way around it. That's kind of interesting. Okay. As far as brake hoses, what's the best philosophy torquing those down as far as the fittings themselves that go from the soft line to the hard line?
Torquing them down as far as tool?
A tool, yeah.
So when you're torquing that down, they have what's called line wrenches.
Yep.
They are probably, if you're used to use a regular open-end wrench, and then you've used it for a while, and now all of a sudden you got to use a line wrench. It can be very frustrating because that line wrench, the end of that line wrench, it's actually almost longer, so it goes around the nut better, so it grabs it better. So you'll go to tighten it, and you'll try to get it lined up, and you won't think that it's the right size. So you're flipping them around, trying to get the right size, flipping it around, trying to get. It's always best to stick with a line wrench when you tighten this down. Number one, use the line wrench, and then number two, I don't know why people do this. I don't know if it's because the bolt snaps off, they lose the bracket, or they're frustrated with the whole circumstance. But use the bracket. Always use the bracket that holds the rubber hose or, the flexible hose on it's typically on a suspension component or maybe even a frame. Reuse that bracket so that when you go to tighten this down, you're able to torque that hard line onto that hose properly.
And okay, good answer for his question there. We're coming on our last 4 minutes here of the live cast. Keep those questions coming, and even if you submit them, if you're watching this later on, we'll keep an eye on the comments for this. Is it okay to use a bolt to replace one that has a shoulder? I guess he's talking about this area right here. Mm-hmm. And one that has full threads, even if it fits. Is there an issue with that?
So that shoulder bolt generally is stronger because it's less likely to shear compared to a full threaded bolt. Typically, your shoulder bolt is going to be a higher grade, where the full threaded bolt is going to be more of a medium duty bolt. So again, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here. What are you doing? Is it something that's going to be under high impact, a lot of stress? What? Or is this something that it's just holding a brake or a fuel line to the frame?
Well, we got one last question. What's your advice for quickly cleaning off thread locking compound off of a bolt?
Well, I always take it over to the grinder. No, not grinder, but
the wire wheel.
Wire wheel, sorry, the wire wheel, and just cleaning it off that way. That, or you could even use one of these thread chasers. That would be another one too.
I've also found out that the induction heater, you bake it a little bit, it comes off a little bit easier than most.
Oh, I could see that. Yeah, no, I could definitely see that.
Well, Mark, I'd like to thank you for being part of our live cast today, and thank you to Summit Racing for sponsoring this. This has been a great opportunity to talk about fasteners. Keep it going. There's a few great articles on the Tomorrow's Technician website, and I think on the On All Cylinders blog from Summit Racing too. I think there's 3 really good articles on fasteners and fittings. So I'd like to thank our audience for attending, and everybody have a great day, and thank you to Summit Racing for sponsoring this. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.